Good afternoon, everybody out there in Internetlandia. Welcome to the fourth day of the 2022 Lit and Loose Festival. My name is Daniel Borzutzky. I am a poet and translator, and I've been on Team Lit and Loose since it started in 2014. I'm also a professor at UIC and a director of our newly formed Center for Latinx Literature of the Americas, which is a co-sponsor of today's event. So please feel free to learn more about the Center for Latinx Literature of the Americas through our website. We're having lots of events, both in person and virtually. This year's Lit and Loose Festival features both in-person events in Chicago and virtual events such as this one. You should also visit the Lit and Loose website at litloose.org. This is the 9th year of the Lit and Loose Festival, which is sponsored by Make Literary Productions. The Lit and Loose Festival supports the creation of new art through international collaboration, making space for essential dialogues between residents of Mexico and the United States. This year's festival theme, Revision, re-envisioning the arts in light of the pandemic, reconsidering the canon, and revising language for the future. For those of you who are not familiar with the Lit and Loose Festival, it is the brainchild of Chicago's Sarah Dodson, who works extremely hard behind the scenes to make all of this happen. And it is a collaboration between writers and artists from Chicago and the United States with writers and artists from Mexico. This week, the writers and artists from Mexico have come to Chicago, where they are doing several events, and also tonight at the Logan Center in Hyde Park at 7:30 will be performing their collaborations with the Chicago artists as part of the culminating event of the festival. So today's event is super special. We're really excited to be able to host the very first event for the new essay anthology, Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry, which will be published in early 2023 by the University of New Mexico Press. Actually, Ruben can correct me on the date of that, but it is forthcoming from the University of New Mexico Press, and it is edited by one of our guests, Ruben Quesada, who can tell you a little bit more about the anthology as he presents. The Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry collects personal and academic writing from Latino, Latin American, Latinx, and Luso poets about the nature of poetry and its practice. At the heart of the anthology lies the intersection of history, language, and the human experience. The essays not only expand the poetic landscape, but extend Latinx and Latin American linguistic and geographical boundaries. And I'm wrong about the release date. It's sooner than that, but Ruben can tell us the exact date. Our presenters today, in this order, will be Ruben Quesada, who is a Chicago-based poet, translator, and editor of this fantastic anthology. He's the author of Revelations and Next Extinct Mammal, and the translator of a collection of selected poems by Luis Cernuda titled Exiled from the Throne of Night. He has served as an editor and coordinator for the Rumpus, the Kenyon Review, Agni, and the National Book Critics Circle Board, and he comes to us today from Chicago. After Ruben presents, we will hear from ire'ne Lara Silva, who is the author of 4 poetry collections, Furia, Blood Sugar Canto, Huicali, House of Song, and First Poems, as well as 2 chapbooks, Enduring Azucares, and Hibiscus Tacos, and a short story collection, Flesh to Bone. He then is currently working on a second collection of short stories titled The Light of Your Body. We will then hear from Sheryl Luna, who joins us from Colorado. Her book, Magnificent Errors, received the Ernest Sandine Prize and was published by the University of Notre Dame Press. She's also the author of Pity the Drowned Horses, recipient of the Andres Montoya Prize, and Seven, a finalist for the Colorado Book Award. Recent poems have appeared in Poetry, Wisache, and the Saranac Review. So the structure of today's event will be as follows. Each of our presenters will read a poem and then a short excerpt from their essay in the anthology. After that, we'll all get together, have a bit of conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions as well. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first presenter and the editor of the anthology, Ruben.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to Make Lit and Loose Literary Production, Sarah Dodson, Troy, David, who are helping us here today, Daniel and the Center for Latinx Literature of the Americas, and to all the participants here and all of you watching today. It's a pleasure to be here with you. This is an anthology that's been many years in the making. It will be published in less than 2 weeks on November 15th. It's currently available for pre-order, but it will be in everyone's hands by November or on November 15th. I want to start by reading a little bit about a little bit of the introduction, which gives you some context for these essays, and read you a poem of mine. I'm going to start with a poem. It's one that exemplifies what I was really interested in learning about in these anthologies, people's backgrounds and how it informs their understanding and their writing of poetry. And so this is a poem of mine from a manuscript I'm currently working on. This is called My Mother is a Garden. In the backyard, my mother plants strands of razzleberry fringe flowers. Next door, the chartreuse golden feather farewell. Before I am born, my mother is acquired by the United States, coerced by some American zodiac dream. She fled to Los Angeles, and decades later, she still withholds from speaking English, and only fertile names of flowers have taken root. She is luminous, her hair a blackish gray against the philodendron, long and parted in the center. I lose her in the shade of overgrown impatiens hanging onto the hillside behind the house. The horizon waves in lines of barberry and nettles, silver waves of wild deergrass. I have not spoken to my mother in years. Today I surprise her with a visit, and in the window's glow, I watch her work. I have taken the shape of her hips. The essays in this anthology perfectly describe the variety of experience of Latinx poets. The Latinx community is not a monolith, and these contributions account for an increasingly pluralistic representation in contemporary writing, where the life of the individual constantly evolves into an uncertain and complex ethos. I turn to essays on the art of poetry to find the resiliency of poetic composition that will outlast us all. I turn to ideas on poetics that have served to forge the social function of poetry for millennia. It is through the commonality of language and associative meaning where readers find a connection to a depicted experience. In the spring of 2007, Francisco Aragon published The Wind Shifts, New Latinx Poetry. The anthology collects poetry by 25 Latinx poets, and it was featured on the Poetry Foundation podcast in July of the same year. In an interview, Aragon acknowledges the importance of contemporary Latinx poets assimilating into American culture. He notes that contemporary poets have acculturated into the American tradition without losing sight of their own Latinx identity by drawing on the social and political movements of the 1970s via code switching. through an artful use of language to create a mosaic of emotion and story. Another anthology called Angels of the Americlips, an anthology of new Latina writing from 2013, edited by Carmen Jimenez and John Chavez, was the first major mixed genre anthology of Latinx writing that acknowledged and focused on Latinx literature's innovative and experimental strand. Over the last decade, Latinx poets have created a written world of experiences. And they create not only out of love of their primary world, but also perhaps more importantly, out of the challenges they face because of their cultural and racial identities. The most recent edition of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics recognizes the study of poetry of the past in the information age is sometimes conceived as an antiquarian field, a field of theoretical issues or reflections on the practice of writing poetry. As a Latinx person and poet in the United States, I recognize the importance of my literary Latinx predecessors, the influence that history and American literature has had on their work, their intersection into my own history, and the impact on the American literary tradition. The essays in this anthology are a spectrum of voices and varied understandings. These essays offer a deeper perspective on the richness and excellence of Latinx poetry. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our next presenter. Please welcome Ire'ne Lara Silva.
Hello, thank you, Ruben. I just wanted to thank everyone for the invitation, and I'm glad to be able to join y'all today. There are two things I'm going to share with y'all. One of them is a poem from my collection, Equicacali, House of Song, and it's the very first poem in the collection. I live in Austin, Texas, and we have a beautiful river that flows through the city, the Colorado River. But I spent a lot of my childhood on the South Texas border, very close to the Rio Grande. And so about 20 years after moving to Austin, I was crossing the river. And this one specific morning, I couldn't help but think about the contrast between those two rivers. And this poem was born. You love a river. For 20 years, you love a river. And every time you cross it or sit to stare at it, you imagine your suddenly immense hands brushing over its calm ripples, as if it was fur, as if it was skin, as if it could touch you back, as if it also loved you, as if it had waited for you always, this peaceful, uncontested river, always serene, so different from that other river, the river that has defined your entire life. The river you love is far, but not that far from that other river. That other river is sometimes muddy, sometimes dry, sometimes green, sometimes lovely. But you can never think of it without seeing almost 2 centuries of blood shed over it. Can never see it without thinking of the lives, the pain, the hurt, the losses crossing that river has cost. You have always loved rivers. But is it still a river if it has walls? And then I'm going to read you a little excerpt from the essay that appears in the anthology. The essay is titled La Desembocada, Healing the Wound That Never Heals. And I'm going to skip to kind of the middle of it. I was raised as a daughter of migrant truck drivers, meaning that they traveled following the harvest seasons from South Texas to other parts of Texas, to Oklahoma, to New Mexico, and then back to South Texas. And so we did that circuit every single year. So the section I'm going to read starts with that. La Desembocada. Our annual circuit always led back to South Texas. And in the Rio Grande Valley, everything was defined by the river. Which side you lived on, which side you'd been born on, which side your parents were from. At different points, the river was a muddy trickle or a concrete wall, or green and flowing as it was in the crossing I was most familiar with, the bridge into Nuevo Progreso, Tamaulipas. I've crossed that bridge at least 1,000 times, and each time we always paused for a second as we passed the marker that divided Mexico from the United States. Perhaps we felt the most whole, standing there, breathless on a bridge, the river below at the line of demarcation. But if you go further south inside Texas, you find yourself in front of the ocean at the Gulf of Mexico. As a child and as an adult, I spent many hours on South Padre Island and at Port Isabel. One a busy tourist spot, the other almost completely deserted. The road went straight to the sand, to the ocean. Where almost no one ever went, though, was to the mouth of the river, the place where the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo met the ocean, La Desembocada. Ansaldúa speaks of the herida abierta that the Rio Grande is, and it is an open wound, always bleeding, always throbbing, poverty, violence, drugs. But the mouth of the river is another place. No one who lives in the valley goes there or speaks of it, but it is like nothing else. The wind is different there. The birds are different there. Salt water and fresh water come together, an opposition that creates verdant life, borning and tumbling and turning. The mouth of the Rio Grande is like the end of the world, where transformation and choice and imagination are physical, visceral things. How to draw a line there, where one thing is always becoming another? Roar of salt water, sigh of fresh water. What is a poet if not the mouth of the river, channeling language, pouring it into the ocean of the world? Gracias. Next up is Sheryl Luna.
I would also like to thank Daniel and Ruben and the Make Lit and Lose, as well as the University of Illinois. I'm honored to be here. I'm going to read a poem called Lowering Your Standards for Food Stamps. Words fall out of my coat pocket, soak in bleach water. I touch everyone's dirty dollars. Maslow's got everything on me. 14 hours on my feet, no breaks, no smokes or lunch, blank-eyed movements, trash bags, coffee burner, fingers numb. I am hourly protestations and false smiles. The clock clicks its slowing. Faces blur in a stream of hurried soccer games, sunlight, and church certainty. I have no poem to carry, no material illusions. Cola spilled on hands, so sticky-fingered, I'm far from poems. I'd write of politicians, refineries, and a border's barbed wire. But I am unlearning America's languages with a mop. In a summer hot red polyester top, I sell lotto tickets. Cars wait for gas billowing black. Killing time has new meaning. A jackhammer breaks apart a life. The slow globe spirals, and at night black space has me dizzy. Visionaries off their meds and whacked out meth heads sing to me. A panicky fear of robbery and humiliation drips with my sweat. Words, some say, are weeping twilight and sunrise. I am drawn to dramas, the couple arguing, the man headbutting his wife in the parking lot. 911, no metered obit, and nobody but myself to blame. I'm going to read 3 paragraphs from the essay in the anthology titled Trauma and the Lyric. Lyric poetry helps people deal with strong emotions in order to live contemplatively and fully. Some people argue that poetry is not therapy, and telling the story of abuse, whether rape or oppression, is not popular in some schools of thought of poetry. However, it is necessary political and personal. It is a necessary political and personal act of courage. The lyric can bring awareness of suffering and alleviate suffering, and this alleviation is a beautiful thing. The transformative emotional power of poetry can help people move beyond victimization to a place of pride and power. I survived childhood sexual abuse, and I know poetry helps us live and thrive in this world by healing the wounds of the past so that we can move on to a new place. Jeffrey C. Alexander defines trauma in the following manner. Trauma occurs when individuals and groups feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their consciousness, will mark their memories forever, and will change their future in fundamental and irrevocable ways. Trauma survivors often struggle with survivors' guilt and blame themselves for the abuse. Rather than developing a strong sense of identity, a person feels fragmented or dissociated and can even forget the historical events that created the trauma. The trauma creates a sense of shame that is internalized, and sometimes this shame fosters a lack of pride in one's culture. Trauma does not occur in a vacuum. An individual's trauma often occurs within the context of community. Such shaming lives in the overall consciousness of the Mexican American culture, and cultures can collectively react to trauma, whether the trauma is to an individual or cultural group. Entire communities can be shaped by violent or oppressive histories. Many Latinos have forgotten past traumas, such as the dousing of Mexicans with the toxic chemicals before they crossed the border into the United States. Members of an oppressed or marginalized group may feel it is a dangerous world and find it difficult to trust white people or people outside of their culture. This hypervigilance is a symptom of trauma. Individuals and communities can also be re-traumatized and triggered by situations similar to their early trauma, whether it is recognized or goes unrecognized. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those wonderful poems and excerpts from the essays. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. So we'll just start by chatting a little bit. And audience members, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and they will be communicated to us. And we will try to address them. But I thought that maybe we could begin with Ruben and maybe just talk about, if you could talk about, on the one hand, like the organizing principles of the anthology, one, and then two, you were kind of getting at in your introduction the kind of range of poetic approaches that you see as part of Latinx writing, and I wonder if maybe you can kind of talk about that as well, and maybe how that range is present in the anthology.
Sure. Thank you for those questions, and thank you everybody for your work. Putting this to, I spent many years putting this together. The idea and origins for this anthology, my goodness, started probably in the late 90s. At least that's when the idea first came to fruition. But I didn't really act on it until about a decade ago. And when I was beginning to put this together, back in 2012, when I first wrote the proposal for this anthology, in 2012 it was a different world, and the concerns that I had about content and contributors was different. So at the time, my concerns included having contributors who lived in different parts of the country. That was kind of one criteria that was really important and valuable to me, simply because as a person who writes a lot about where they grew up, and that's Los Angeles, place made a real impact on my worldview. And so it was really important for me to include poets who lived in different places in the US. Additionally, I wanted to include poets who had a background in Latin America from different countries. So place was really important to me. But as time went on, as I began to think about putting a call out for the anthology, and I started talking to different people about the project and listening to things that they were interested in, I began to think about ways to be what we would call today much more inclusive, much more diverse, and as we know, the Latin American people in the U.S. with Latin American heritage have so many layers to them, which include language and race and cultural identity and social class, educational background, and so my view of the anthology and thinking about how to organize it and what kind of contributors I wanted began to expand. And sometimes we have this we have an idealization of the kind of project we want to accomplish, and when we present that to a press, to someone to publish it, then we discover some constraints. And so I knew that that I wanted to include as many different types of perspectives and approaches, and that includes academic perspectives and also personal perspectives. So this anthology includes poets who have varying educational backgrounds, who speak different types of languages. So some of the contributors in this anthology, their primary language, native language, or their heritage speakers of Portuguese, and there are contributors who have a background in Spanish, and also have a connection to indigenous cultures. And so aside from my own personal desire to include as many different types of people with different backgrounds in this anthology, it was also dependent on who was available to contribute something. The majority, if not all of these contributions to the anthology are essays that were written specifically for this anthology. And there aren't often, there isn't often a lot of time to put something together for an anthology that calls for a prose piece, particularly from people who might be in the habit of or practice of writing poetry exclusively. So asking for something that was critical of their own work, asking someone to really reflect on the process of writing was something that I was quite excited about. And fortunately, I was able to acquire 24 contributions for this anthology. There were a number of other essays that I received that didn't make it into the anthology, and that had a lot of the reasoning for some of them not making it into anthology had to do with logistical reasons, either copyright issues or even though this anthology took many years to put together, sometimes editing someone's work, it can be difficult to arrive at a compromise for an essay that would speak to others in this anthology. It's like curating an exhibit, and so sometimes some essays just couldn't find a home in the book. So there's so many different things to think about when putting an anthology of this breadth together, that I just wanted to include as many different voices, experiences as I could, and I feel really fortunate that I was able to find 24 poets to share their thoughts with me.
Excellent. Well, we cannot wait to see it out in the world. So Ruben presented us with like lots of different frames for how to understand the abstract concept of Latinx. So one of them being regional, one of them being through national background, another being about educational or perhaps even kind of class experience, another being through language. And I'm wondering, maybe for Sheryl first, and then ire'ne, how you, this is kind of a broad question, but maybe how you see yourself in relation to this abstract concept of Latinx poetics, how you see your own work either in dialogue with like the history of Latinx poetics or the present of Latinx poetics or its various traditions, and some of the kind of frames that I just mentioned.
Well, I think for a long time I struggled with my identity. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, and I grew up with an abusive stepfather who would not like let us speak any Spanish in the house, and I think that shaped me when I went to college, especially in graduate school, to honor my mother and the women in my life. I think poverty is traumatic for people, a large part of Latino culture. And I think for my own process, this last book deals with mental illness, poverty, and homelessness. And I think anytime someone is other or othered, they are often demonized nowadays with what's going on with Mexicans are rapists and all this stuff. So I feel compelled to still write about El Paso and my culture, my upbringing. I have a couple of, well, I have 2 poems in the new book. One of them is called something like Tornillo's Tent Prison for Children. I don't think you can grow up on the border without being affected by it, and I want to keep writing to celebrate marginalized peoples of all kinds. I just hope that answers.
Sure. Nene, would you like to jump in?
It's kind of it's an interesting question to try to answer in a couple minutes. So stop me if I go on too far, too long. But so regionally, South Texas is the part I mostly claim. Although I grew up wandering all over the place. But it's interesting as I identify myself, as an indigenous identified Mexican American Texan. And it's interesting to me because everywhere I go, people assume that I'm an immigrant, first generation, or that or assume that I'm not from the United States. And people don't know that there are lots of people that grow up in Texas and across the Southwest and in other places. I grew up speaking Spanish. I was born here. My parents were born here. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born here. I have, in some ways, my tie to Mexican identity is in some ways as tenuous as an indigenous identity. because I can't claim native, but I know damn well I'm indigenous. So, it's that nebulous space in between that is one of the areas that I like to investigate a lot. A lot of my work also, ends up intersecting with queer poetics and disabled poetics and, regional and feminist. I actually read my first poems to people, not in classrooms or in cafes or bookstores, but at protests. And so a lot of the way that I approach poetry, of what I think poetry is, comes from being very involved in protest and in reading those poems to people that we're trying to organize for some, positive, effective change. And so that lingers always. And I think a lot of my work, whatever genre it's in, has to do with how we approach shame, how we can bridge the going back to some of what Sheryl was saying, what the traumas that inform shame and the way that shame informs traumas, whether that's something about reaching out for help when it comes to a physical disability, to learning how to bridge differences rather than to shame each other for having differing levels of comfort with speaking Spanish or speaking indigenous languages or speaking anything else. The ways that we sometimes, are shamed or shame each other for the way that we identify as Latinx or Latino or Hispanic or Mexican American or whatever we identify ourselves as, to be open to everyone at whatever way they define their identity. The way that I see it, as I love and appreciate who I am and where I came from, I want to honor where other people come from and what they identify as. And that, I think, is not about necessarily being, it is about being inclusive. It is about building rather than destroying. And it's about how we empower others, as we empower ourselves.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe I'll toss it back to Ruben, and if you all have questions for each other, feel free to jump in too. But one of the things that what is hard about talking both about Latinx literature as well as putting together a collection like this is, I think that there are sort of stereotypical ideas of what Latinx literature might be, and that doing the work of kind of creating a collection of bringing together a collection of writers, I think you are both kind of acknowledging traditions while also acknowledging the kind of expansiveness of them. And I wonder how you thought about that question of kind of creating both a concept like of the idea of Latinx being a useful frame, while at the same time it not being a reductive frame. I don't know if that's articulated well, but it seems to me that those are two kind of that between those two being reductive is a danger, and how to kind of find the usefulness in it while not erasing things and kind of saying that all of Latinx experience can be kind of encapsulated and easily.
There's in my introduction and in Juan Felipe Herrera's foreword, I think there's there's some interesting moments where we both recognize that the act of naming, of trying to contain these multitudes and layers of being are they're seemingly impossible. I think that as we begin to understand and recognize the nuances of our own cultures and of people, we begin to understand that there are parts of people that need to be named, that need to be acknowledged. And so, I went back and forth when I was thinking about just naming this collection. I think when I started the proposal, I called it Latino Poetics, and then I think you and I, Daniel, probably many years ago, were talking about the X in Latinx, and and what that meant, or how we interpreted that, and it's I think that it's really difficult to hold for a label like Latinx, or to hold so much that encompasses who we are as people today, and everything that we bring with us. I'm thinking, as I'm listening to ire'ne speak about how you were talking just now about your various identities, and how everything is kind of, your past informs who you are today, and so it's really difficult, I think, to just it's a difficult place to just use the term Latinx, knowing that there's so many more nuances to an individual, which include race, language, and it's space. How do we? There's a question I see about transcending. How do we transcend place, space, and time while simultaneously forming a community? And so I think that the term Latinx is limiting, but and it's limiting because it doesn't on its face value acknowledge and recognize so many things that make us who we are. But I see it as a starting point. I just see it simply as a place to start. And as we know, living in this country, at least for the systems or the institutions that exist today, there needs to be a starting point for people to begin to recognize who we are. And I think that Latinx is a place to begin. I don't think it's a end point, but I like how I like the name of the center here at UIC. The Center for Latinx Literatures of the Americas. I really love this kind of broad idea of naming these bodies in the Western Hemisphere and acknowledging their collectivity, and how literature from the Americas is I mean, there's so much there, and I'm not sure. It's a really difficult question.
Yeah, no, thank you. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question?
We're gonna say pass. Next question.
I'll say a little bit.
Sure. Thank you.
The term Latinx is inclusive, and I think it is a healthy thing to happen. But I think there are a lot of people who don't understand the term and are angry about it. And I think the best thing is to educate people, and I think that's something that's important. I know people who think it's a silly term, and but I think if they aren't familiar with it and the purpose of it eludes them. So I think the anthology, reading poems, getting the message out in the community is very important.
So we heard just like and audience members, if you have questions, please feel free to share them. I'll ask one more question, and then we have a question that we will address. But I wonder, just from Sheryl and ire'ne, we just heard a snippet of your essays, and I wonder if you could maybe just tell us what you would like readers to take away from your essays that they might not have heard. Just big ideas that you were trying to get across, or more kind of subtle points even.
So Ruben will probably be relieved to hear that I reread my essay recently, this past weekend. And I don't think I'd looked at it in several years. And I wrote it probably a decade ago. So I was glad to find out that, myself from 10 years ago still agrees with me now. Because sometimes you don't know, you're changing things in tremendous ways over a couple of years, and especially over a decade. But part of what that essay, and it's a short essay, but part of what I was trying to do was to think about Anzaldua's phrase about the border being una herida abierta, and the way that a lot of people transfer that over into thinking that culture, or that multiculturalism, or that bilingualism, or multilingualism, that all of these things are wounds. I realized that for a long time now, I've been trying to not always use the language of wounds to describe what Latinx is, or to describe my experience, or to describe a border experience. The point of Cuicacali, or not the point of it, but the main thought that I went into it with was to think about not wounds and healing, but about strength and sources of strength. And in fact, Cuicacali, which literally translates to house of song, was in Nahuatl culture where young men would go to train to be warriors. And I was so caught by the idea that it would be a house of song where one would learn strength and where one would learn to fight. And so that's one of the things I think that I always go to culture and language and poetry for. That is where one goes to become strong. That is where one goes to learn oneself and then to develop all those things. And so rereading this essay, which I wrote 10 years ago, I realized that part of what I was doing in that essay was the very beginnings of those thoughts, which was to think about Anzaldúa, to think about the border as a wound, and then actually to go to another queer writer, to go to Federico Garcia Lorca and think about his work on El Duende and what we could find there, which I think very interestingly spoke to Anzaldúa's quote, and about what we can do in poetry, what we can do in literature, what we can do, all literature, but specifically what I'm writing and what I'm working on, to how we move from wound to strength, how we redefine what all those things are, how we even redefine the terms that we use, to conceptualize them in different ways, and how then our culture and our language and our experiences become this tremendous source, to change internally and externally.
Thank you. And Sheryl, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think I read an older version of my essay. Sorry, I didn't have the other one, but I would like to say I kind of agree with ire'ne. Part of recovery from abuse is to learn to take your power back, to let go of the shame and take your power back. And I think that applies to personal power and cultural and collective power. And it's to embrace and empower ourselves is what my answer is for that.
Daniel, I think you're muted.
That old trick. I think that you addressed the question about collectivity that was asked, but as you answer forthcoming questions, feel free to say more about that. We have a question from Rachel Galvin, who asks, the capacious and comparative nature of the anthology is exciting, and what do you think emerges or becomes clear by bringing this range of writers together. What are some of the advantages and benefits? Were there surprises for you? And you could start there.
I think one of the biggest surprises was that there are so many other people that I really want in this book. I mean, this is a collection. I think that could be volumes. You know, there could be so many more volumes of this collection because there's so many more perspectives and poets every year. You know, as when I started this and thinking about this anthology, and you know, in thinking to date, how many Latinx poets or poets from Latin America who are here in the U.S. are now being published and read. You know, it's getting difficult to keep up. There's so many books, and so one thing that became quite clear as this book was getting ready to, you know, to become final is that there are so many poets that I wish I could just start over or just start another anthology, because there's so many more poets that I want to hear from. But you know, again, as I said a moment ago, you know, forging these kind of communities can be difficult. It's difficult for a variety of reasons. Some poets don't want to write you know, analytical prose about poetry, or there are people who just don't have the time to do it. But you know, I think one of the advantages of putting so many different poets together is that it does inform and educate communities about the different perspectives that exist within this seemingly, you know, monolith. And so I think that the biggest takeaway for readers will be that there are so many different perspectives, and our experiences are incredibly varied.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes left. There's another question in the chat from our own M. Williamson, who works with us at the Center for Latinx Literature and helped to make this event possible. So thank you. And that M says, "I love the diversity of Latinx identity you're advocating for. And did you have a similar curatorial goal to show a diverse range of perspectives on the concept of poetics?" I guess that is for Ruben, and then maybe I'll ask a concluding question for everybody.
That's a great question, and it really does lie at the heart of, you know, the impetus behind putting this together was my desire to learn about different perspectives. You know, I went to graduate school, and you know, I went to college like a lot of the contributors, and you know, collected my degrees, but I wanted to hear from people who had varying backgrounds, varying perspectives, both academic and non-academic. There's an essay by Stephen. There's a contribution in the anthology by Stephen Cordova, a New York-based poet, who I absolutely love it, because it's such a lyric essay, and it's a lyric moment in the anthology that is so unlike some of the more academic leaning essays, that I feel that it really opens up a perspective and offers insight, and really features like this love for just writing, and you know, and that's really, I think, what moves a lot of us to do the work we do is not simply to just tell our story, but because we love language, and Stephen Cordova's essay, I think, is a really great example of that.
Thank you so much. So maybe just include everybody on the spot, for which I apologize, but I wonder if we could just have a quick round where everybody maybe names a couple of recent-ish books of Latinx poetry or literature that have been really exciting to you over the last few years. And if Sheryl, you'd like to start us off, that would be wonderful.
I think I like this poet named Ocean Vuong, And I can't remember the title of this book. I read it a while back, but he writes about his Vietnamese immigrant experience. Um, and then I like Lorna de Cervantes. I feel she's sort of a mentor and a person that I would like to emulate with my work.
Ire'ne?
I'm hunting for a title. Here we go. I found it. Okay. So last year I went a little crazy and I said yes to judging a few too many contests. I think I'm still missing a patch of hair from back here that I pulled out. But but I read some beautiful, beautiful books, and it reaffirmed the reason why I say yes to judging things, because it would have hurt my heart if these people hadn't won. So three of the most amazing things that I read, poetry collections in the last couple of years. Shara Hammonds Miller, Maps of Injury, gorgeous, gorgeous book. KB Brookins has a chapbook out, How to Identify Yourself with a Wound. And Hyde Erich's Little Big Bully. So just some glorious work. I mean, with all of them, I had to stop and read poems out loud because of just the music of them and the emotion of them. And some of them, I found myself breaking into sobs, midway, barely able to even figure out what had launched me to that point or had pushed me to that point. But just tremendous books. So Maps of Injury, How to Identify Yourself with a Wound, and Little Big Bully.
And Ruben?
I've been reading a lot of poetry this year, and a lot of Latinx poetry in particular. At the end of every year, I write like an omnibus review of Latinx poetry books that were published in the year. And there's one book that is still sitting on my desk because I found in the last few years that poets have started to embrace more hybrid work. And it might be just because there are more presses who are willing to publish it. One press in particular that I really love is Noemi Press, founded by Carmen Jimenez. So I'm reading a book called City Without Altar by Jasmine Mendez, and I just can't put it down. I keep going back to it, and it's it's a hybrid collection about the body and the body as a boundary or border even, and so there's text, there's image, there's historical document and research, and I love all these pieces that come together. It's some people may call it eco-poetics. It's this ecosystem that's created in a collection, and so it's City Without Altar is the book that I'm currently examining.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we will conclude with that. So I want to thank our contributors so much for all of your thoughts and work and time today. I want to thank all of the audience members who have joined us, everybody at Make and Lit and Loose, the many staff members and volunteers that have helped to make this event and the festival possible. The Seminary Co-op Bookstore in Chicago. You can pre-order Latinx Poetics from them. We also need to thank the National Endowment for the Arts, Illinois Humanities, Vocalo, and many other generous partners, grant makers, and donors. For those of you in the Chicago area, please check out the live magazine show tonight at the Logan Center for the Arts in Hyde Park at 7:30. And there are still some events remaining in the next few days, including workshops and presentations around town. So please try to make it to some of those events. So thank you again, and everybody have a lovely day. Ciao.